We've heard some very interesting stuff today. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Arabs for the amazing job that they've done on putting the report together this year. They took over the task from us unprofessionals after the first report and have done a sterling job. Simon Roberts in particular, who's been working with John Miles, I'd like to thank for a brilliant job of coordinating us all. It's not been easy for you. We're all quite maverick in our own ways. In summing up today, I'd like to say a little bit about recommendations. But I'd like to just make it clear for the final time, because every time that I've looked at the peak oil debate, it seems to come down to camps. When we started looking at this issue 3 years ago, one of the reasons that the companies came together and talked with Jeremy, one of the reasons that people like Brian, Ian, Philip and Richard got involved in this bit of work, was because it was such a polarised debate. You had a number of oil companies at one side of the debate saying the problem doesn't exist. And that was literally where the world was. And then you had people very frenetically at the other side of the debate saying it's almost upon us now. And I think for us as big industrial users of hydrocarbons, it was really important to try and get a balanced view. And I think we've come up with a balanced view in the Oil Crunch report. The first one came up with a reasonably balanced view, but there were a number of areas that actually, as we were putting the report together, one of the words of prophecy, and it was, if there's a major global recession, the like of which we haven't seen for a long time, our prediction is probably going to change slightly. And of course, as we produced the report, that major global recession happened. And we wanted to look again in this report at what that had done. And as John mentioned at the beginning, it's pushed it out maybe a couple of years. We've got some breathing space. We've probably got a 5-year period where demand in the West hasn't picked up significantly, and possibly doesn't pick up for some of the reasons that both Ian and John and Brian and Richard have all mentioned. We are doing more in the West. We're much more carbon conscious than we were. Just as Brian's bus passengers are more carbon conscious, so are airline passengers. And we're conscious of it, even if climate change isn't necessarily quite as man-induced as some have said, and even if that debate has made people slightly more cynical, we're all concerned about pollution and the environment in a more general sense, and that is a feature of our culture today. So I'm not so worried about demand in the West. And when Tony Hayward, the boss of BP, talks about demand in the West is possibly going to fall, he's probably right. But the fact is that that's never going to be matched by the increase in demand in the countries which are emerging stronger and stronger by the day. And it's also going to be a feature, something we haven't mentioned today, is that it's going to be a feature of those growing populations. Countries like Iran, which population is going to go through 100 million over the next 5 or 6 years. As a result, Iran can no longer be a net oil exporter. It's going to need its energy for its own population. And that's going to be happening more and more in countries throughout the world. So if we take the fact that we believe that there is going to be a potential crunch coming, what should the incoming government of the next few years be doing about it? We've already talked about the fact that we need to have a dialogue between industry and government which is rational on this issue. And we need to look at this issue in the round. We can't take the word of one oil company, or one environmental group, or one solar power producer, or one airline, or one railway operator. We've got to come together to look at this. And the kind of recommendations that we're looking for are is a government that recognises that this is a clear and present danger. And to mitigate its effects is complementary with, say, a low carbon strategy as we have at the moment, but we're going to have to hurry up a bit, or there's going to be this period of crunch which is going to be very economically dislocating. And government has got to also consider our own resources in the UK. The fundamental issue that we face here is a balance of payments crisis in the second part of the next decade, which will make all the other things that we're trying to do in terms of shifting to a lower carbon economy and a more energy efficient economy, it's going to make those things harder to do if you're trying to do that through a balance of payments crisis, where literally you might have problems supplying food and energy to the population for a period of time. Therefore, we've got to take actions more quickly. We've got to encourage more production in the North Sea again. We've got to get our own industry working much more efficiently in terms of its own use of energy. And we've got to push forward with solar, wind, wave, nuclear, to a greater extent than we've achieved so far. And that's going to mean legislative change. It's going to mean that we've got to make health and safety legislation work for the future as well. It's got to mean we've got to introduce new technologies much more quickly than we've been planning to do. We've got to get carbon composites into cars in a way that they're not at the moment. We've got to get carbon composites into buses and trains and aeroplanes more quickly than we've been planning. And that's going to mean every organisation in Britain galvanising itself, from the Civil Aviation Authority on one side, to the Health and Safety Executive, right the way through to the legislative background that we face as consumers in terms of encouraging us to produce our own energy and be more efficient in our use of energy. These things have got to be speeded up if we're going to avoid the crunch that comes.